Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Martin Kölling, and I will be the moderator of today. And it's my great honor to welcome our distinguished guest, Professor Koichi Hamada. You all know him very well because he's a frequent speaker already at this club, at least since Prime Minister Abe came to power in 2012. His last appearance, I think he had in 11 months ago, almost on the day, on January 9th, where we asked him to explain Abenomics to us. Now, we are at another crucial point of Prime Minister Abe's reign. Prime Minister Abe basically asked the Japanese people to have a referendum on his Abenomics, and it's a good opportunity for Professor Hamada to explain to us how the Abenomics fared from his point of view. What is his evaluation? What is the grade, basically, that Abenomics basically gets so far from him, the advisor of Prime Minister Abe. I don't know whether you all know the background of Professor Hamada. He was born in Tokyo, and he actually started to study law before changing to economics. Later, he got his MA, Master of Art, and his PhD in economics from Yale University. And then he became a well-known author of books in Japan, also on monetary policy. One of our members just showed a book he translated 30 years ago from English to Japanese. And so Mr. Hamada made his career here in Japan, and in his late years now became one of the top advisors to the Prime Minister. Without any further ado, I would like to give now the microphone to Professor Hamada, and I would like to welcome our guest with a very warm welcome. Thank you very much. Just before we start, may I remind everybody to switch off your cell phones or put them to manner mode, out of courtesy to our guest. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kölling. Ladies and gentlemen, actually I didn't need this phrase. In the top meeting of Keidanren, I was invited last summer. About 50 or 70 top COE of Japan were all men. So I could have said just gentlemen. And about the translation book, of the book I translated is by my teacher, James Tobin, about the monetary policy and debt problems, still very pertinent subjects in the world. Today I would like to show you the graphs I distributed. Probably the deflation gap, second graph of one page is very talkative. After the Lehman shock, Japan was attacked by the strong wave of yen-daka, high yen appreciation. Without Japan itself was not attacked by any financial problems. Actually, government and the Bank of Japan worked very hard before that to cope with already existing financial crisis. So there was no financial crisis, so to speak. But high appreciation of the yen hit Japan, and Japanese actual GDP, that is in blue lines, and went down about 8% below the potential GDP. Of course, this potential GDP is just imaginary. Nobody saw this value but estimated GDP. And in the countries like UK and the US, where real financial Lehman crisis hit, this gap was about 4% or so. In the case of Japan, it's about 8% of GDP. And that is primarily because the Bank of Japan did not understand the basic nature of international finance, and they let the yen appreciation stand still. That made LP goes down, Panasonic and Sharp have a very difficult time for a long time. Yesterday I was watching the debates by the heads of parties, and it was very amusing that Minshato, the Democratic Party of Japan, says that during the Minshato area, the growth rate, of real growth rate is higher than the years of Abenomics, because it came down from this trough. And you see the effect of Tohoku earthquake during 11, and Mr. Abe started with about the end of the next trough, the second or third, the third or fourth quarter of 2012, and succeeded it to bring the actual GDP, that is blue, to almost touch the potential GDP line, the Japanese growth path that is imagined to express the total capacity of production. But the last, and I was misled even, that we almost reached the full employment level or full capacity level. So it is a time of changing to demand policy to supply policy, because supply is terribly weak, slowly going up. But this touch was due to the pullback demand, accelerating demand of consumers. So after that, there is some setback in GDP statistics, as you see. I think this is the most recent graph, because of the consumption tax raise. And consumption tax rate was in the medium or long run necessary because the Japanese government is very, very poor, or they are doing bicycling operations, kind of Ponzi game. That's a dirty word, but since in the case of Ponzi game, you exhaust the client of newly borrowable, but in the case of government, there is usually always somebody from the next generation to pay taxes. So it is feasible, but it is not stable for appropriate for the sake of the steady fiscal policy and public expenditures that are anyway needed. So it is in the right direction, but it is in the opposite direction from Abenomics. Abenomics first two arrows are trying to make this blue arrows to come to the ceiling or capacity limit by encouraging demand, monetary supply through stock market or through yen depreciation. So the direction of the consumption tax raise, however it's needed in the long run, was just the opposite direction of the first, or particularly the second arrow. And I thought, since Abenomics was doing quite vigorously during these 2 years, consumption tax raise, those 3% is a little harder, could be managed, but it seems it didn't. So Mr. Honda, my colleague as special advisors, was right that we should have been more careful in doing that. And the second and the third quarter didn't show remarkable upbeat, so people are worrying. But I think once this heavy burden to 2 arrows is now postponed for 1 year and a half, the Japanese economy will have no problem to recover to the past trend, because the only reason this has this strong gap, as well as the peak by pullback, was due to the fact we imposed 3% increase. That is rather discrete or heavy, sharp increase in consumption tax in various countries' history. So we need to worry about still demand. The first arrow and second arrow are very important. Now people start talking that first and second arrow cannot continue. That's true. If you print money and then goods comes out forever, this is like the land of cocaine or something you can enjoy freely. But the reality is, if you reach some capacity limit, monetary policy will lead to more inflationary possibilities. And government expenditure will go to narrow sector, excess demand, where you cannot, some impasse that cannot be dealt with further increase in fiscal policy in particular sectors. So these 2 arrows will be ended, hopefully will be ended in maybe half a year or year and a half. That's true. So the third arrow is always important. And the third arrow is but difficult to implement. The main reason is there will be political resistance. But you cannot accuse Japanese government of not achieving third arrow so quickly. But look at, say, Obama's migration law, or like that each country, even though policymakers have some idea to improve the situation, and people more or less agree with this. The structural reforms has always some resistant element in the society. Probably I cannot talk about this long list of third arrow, but first one is the population growth. The reason this red line in deflation gap is growing so slow is that working population in Japan is not growing, sometimes declining. And population birth encouragement is necessary, but it is very difficult to improve population growth also, except in 25 years, even if successful. So migration is to be considered seriously. But migration has a lot of social barriers. Japan enjoys so safe, so cultured, and so homogeneous society. And in order to change this culture, even though it has a direct merit to the population growth problem, it will need a long process of political thing. Like, it's like nuclear energy problem. For us as a whole, nuclear energy is sometimes necessary or very helpful to conduct economic development. But that's on the other hand, those people who live near Fukushima or any nuclear generators, they have immediate problem of, I don't say immediate problem, possibility of danger. And also waste problem is worldwide very difficult. So again, like migration problem, I think the voters' voice should be heard in the case we go for migration or we go for nuclear energy adoptions, because interests of people are not homogeneous. That is one thing. Second thing is TPP, but I won't talk very much about the TPP because the factor that holds back TPP is not Japanese right now. I think the political issues in the Democrats in the United States is the immediate hurdle for that. Third is deregulation. If you come to this country by airplane, Haneda Airport is so easy to use, and pollution and so forth is diminishing. However, Chiba Prefecture's governor comes to Kokudocho, land ministry, that please don't increase Haneda flights because Narita will suffer. That kind of thing happens everywhere. So just the regulation is depriving benefit of private people in Japan. This is one example, but there are so many examples that government petty regulations. I am examining. I cannot ever do money laundering, but when I want to shift money from my residing country, US, to Japan, then they have all sorts of, and vice versa. And that those regulations are very petty. So the deregulation is necessary, but you have to ask public bureaucrats to deregulate. So asking, it's as if asking samurai to get out of yoroi, is that wardrobe. So it is intrinsically very difficult. And the hope for Mr. Abe is that he and the cabinet secretary Suga show all the time their intentions to get rid of unnecessary resistance from public administrators. Of course, politicians should be ready for number, accounting, back number things, and private business should be ready for abolishing many unnecessary help for corporate sectors, like in Japan, soze tokubetsu or sotoku, or special tax measures. That is very distorting, as well as increasing the power of bureaucrats who can do the minor adjustment of regulations or tax reduction, like newspaper, is in favor of the corporate tax. No. Consumption tax, I should be careful. Increase very much generally, even after Mr. Abe decided. There are so many articles that talks about the special reduction of consumption taxes, and they will get by the case-by-case reduction. And that kind of thing are plenty still, I think, in Metti's economic policies. That should be reformed, and only special adjustment is to be done for the rescue of poor sort of the fifth quintile of the population that suffers most from consumption tax raise and import oil prices and so forth. And so that I'd like to leave more time for discussion, so I round up. But the important thing is to reduce, not increase, of course, the very internationally high corporate tax. Not as now Ministry of Finance says 1% or 2%, but by 5% or by 10%. Still 25% of corporate tax is not so low in the international standard. So that is one of the most important area of third arrow. And the third, this is doesn't need cooperation of case-by-case cooperation of bureaucrats. So this can be done if Mr. Abe is determined to do so. My research career, I was interested in international economic wars, like currency wars, like corporate tax reduction war. And it's like inviting other countries' investors or keeping Japan's investors from going out by making Japanese business environment more cozy for them. And to conclude, I'd like to say I didn't come as a political advisor or any election speech writer, so I'm not in the part of the present election. But if Abe loses, then Abenomics will be gone. It's okay. Please return to Minshito, the PJ type of regimes with lots of youth and employment. That's a choice of people. But I don't think they will choose that. Voters will understand this. But they ask the question, is Abenomics good, particularly in the third arrow? Is it the right policy or something? It's not. I think most of the policies are in the right direction. But they don't have for reform, we need political power, guts, as well as knowledge. And if the voters vote, for example, about the same seats of LDP, then Mr. Abe can do the right policies without hindrance. If his political background is weak, then he cannot spend so much political capital to each resistance to his issue. So it is not only the part of the politician to do the right policy, but for the part of the voters to choose the right leaders for this. And I think it applies to diplomacy and so forth. We want to have a more peaceful way, and Mr. Abe is considered to be rather nationalistic, I don't admit. But if he succeeds in economic policy, well, then other countries cannot just let Japan to go. Mr. Abe toured to so many countries, and I think this is a gradual pressure to Chinese government or Korean government that they have to be friendly to Japan. So if this election is actually very important, that if voters give full support of the Abe's economic policy, then the Japanese international relationship will also improve in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your short speech. And 2 minutes to the half an hour, we can already open the floor to questions from the working media first. And if time allows, I will also open the floor for associate members. Please.
Karel van Wolferen. I write books. Professor Hamada, I want to ask you a question about not what is happening, but what is not happening. I think that you also think that the monetary policy is okay, it's a good beginning, but fiscal policy leaves a great deal to be desired. And I have long wondered why there is not a choice for an obvious policy that would help greatly. And that's a housing policy aimed at the expansion of existing living space for ordinary Japanese and the addition, of course, of new homes. A housing policy would obviously be good for the construction company. It would give them something to do besides spoiling the Japanese countryside with unnecessary bridges and tunnels and all that. It would also create new space for consumer goods. It would be tremendous boost for the for consumer spending, and it perhaps also would do something to turn around the so-called birth strike, the unwillingness of a majority of Japanese women, even married women, to to look after a next generation. So why does that not happen? Now, if you tell me that there are social reasons or regulatory reasons, I won't believe you. Something has to do. There's an obstacle to the imagination here, bureaucratic imagination or political imagination. Could you comment on any of this?
I feel honored to be asked by a famous author, and I enjoyed your book many times. But I have a somewhat different opinion about the importance of fiscal and monetary policy. First, Japan was suffering from deflation. Still, inflation expectation hard to create. So the money is related. That is the bread and butter knowledge of economics. I want you to learn that monetary policy is very important. Secondly, fiscal policy, expenditures do many good things, but at the same time it increased the bureaucracy's power. The old industrial policy of Japan that might have worked bureaucrats chose the right industry and they gave them money or support. Sometimes cooperation was useful. But at the end, bureaucrats end up in parachuting to some industrial association there and so. So there are so many ways by the fact that in public sectors, people are not motivated by market mechanism, by power or just authority makes it more important. But I agree that there are, that is my main reply, but I quite agree there are many problems like housing in Japan, or so that could be improved the quality of life. But I don't know. I heard that because of Japan's economic stagnation and powerful overly intervention into the private sectors, many gaijins are leaving Tokyo. They moved to Singapore. They moved to Hong Kong. And housing market in Japan, in Tokyo, is not yet recovered fully, particularly for high quality housing market.
Anthony Rowley, Singapore Business Times. It was always obvious, I think, that the first two arrows were going to have a fairly rapid effect, whereas the third arrow, as I think you said yourself, structural reform takes 5 years, 10 years, or whatever. So do you think the first two arrows were overemphasized, in other words, applied too quickly, and they created expectations that couldn't be fulfilled? And your table here is very interesting, the deflation gap. I mean, obviously, the deflation gap was closing and almost closed. And if the consumption tax had not been increased, presumably Japan would have been in a state of quite strong inflation at the moment. So were Abenomics properly sequenced, do you think, or should the first two arrows have been weaker?
I disagree with you in the sense that the inflation didn't come after this first part of this graph. It was over 1.1 or 2. So for some years, it's okay. It's not after the pullback that inflation came. So I would rather say the third arrow is grossly, if not grossly, overemphasized by now. Look at Takenaka Koizumi reform. That were a very excellent attempt, and they did it seriously. But they couldn't persuade the Bank of Japan to do the demand policy. So that lifting up this red line more does not mean to the life of people at all until demand is fully implemented. So that's Paul Krugman wrote recently on the newspaper that those people who try to mention structural reform, that is, of course, important, I agree, but they try to, if not minimize, reduce the importance of the first and second arrow. For example, Mr. Hayakawa of Fuji Institute, who came from director of the Bank of Japan, already starting, it's already the ceiling is over there. So we should reduce monetary policy impact, stimulus right now. And this is, he is advocating that we should return to Mr. Shirakawa's age, again, dark age, or I would say where the captain couldn't see any sunshine, like in Wagner's Fliegenden Holland, or Flying Dutchmans. So that your suggestion is like that, and I don't want Japanese voters run from that.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm Roy Lockheimer, an old-time member. I'm feeling very old today of this club. Around the time that you went to Yale, I became a member of this club, so it's maybe too long. But let me ask you, in those days, the economists that we read, international economists, were all like Kindleberger and Hom and Rosowski, Okawa, and so on, were talking against economic nationalism. But your policies, if they're yours, seem to be supporting economic nationalism, competitive devaluation. The yen went from a glorious 79 yen to the dollar to now a basement 118. So the Japanese public has lost a great deal of wealth. Are these really the policies that you wanted, competitive devaluation? Thank you.
You mentioned nostalgic names to me, in addition to Jim Tobin, Kindleberger, and Mr. Okawa, who I respected much, and who gave me, in various forms, great education in different, in each different way. But competitive devaluation is my subject. Actually, I was known as an economist because I advocated policy coordinations among countries under the fixed exchange rate. But the situation changes now. It is a flexible exchange rate. And under the flexible exchange rate, each country can undo other countries, sometimes bad, sometimes good influences. So the fault of Shirakawa was mainly that he didn't disengage the effect of the huge monetary expansion in the part of the US and the UK. So Japan was not in the epicenter, but a large wave came as Endaka, and he couldn't get rid of it. That's made this picture. So under the flexible exchange rate, it is possible for each national central bank, if they were clever enough, to disengage bad firms. So the laissez-faire, in one of my papers, I proved that laissez-faire is the best policy for each country under most circumstances. But there are, of course, caveats. For European countries, you cannot do monetary ease or monetary construction so easily. You have to cooperate with European Central Bank. And the European Central Bank, today we talked about, is, if not dominated, but strongly influenced by the philosophy of German or interest of German people. And that makes it, they have two hurdles. One is to understand monetary policy is necessary, but each country doesn't have because they don't have their own money, they have to ask the ECB, but the ECB is governed by more conservative monetary policy people. So you cannot do in the double negative sense, the double sense to do this monetary policy. So for the countries that are governed by some kind of fixed exchange rate, like euro, your comment is right that currency devaluation of a single country may have significant effect on the other country. That's true.
Hello, Mr. Hamada. My name is Baumgartner. I'm working for Swiss television. What do you expect from Mr. Abe after the elections in terms of structural reforms? What are you telling him? What do you want him to do? You always graded this structural reform E on your own scale. And do you think the bureaucracy will let him do the necessary reforms?
The campaign against the campaign for consumption tax hikes, engineered mainly by Ministry of Finance and also substantially by the Prime Naikaku, that the Cabinet Office, was first considered to be the norm rather than exception. Always, if the MOF says something, then the politician will follow. But it didn't like this time. Even though I think it was a good thing to have taken off that special clause for business cycle considerations, because otherwise Japanese government looked like a very weak-minded entity not to do the right thing. But this time, the Minister of Finance opinions are rejected by the Prime Minister and the main part of the cabinet. So I think there is some hope, but unless Mr. Abe will make a landslide victory, political capital he can use to cope with his all political resistance are limited. So if I don't have chance to talk to national voters, but it is not the question that Abe policy is right or not, but in order to accomplish the right policy, the Abe government needs stronger support from the public.
And as follow-up question, what would you advise as first next steps if he gets a big majority again? What would you advise him to do first?
I see.
The new government.
I don't know. There are three or four things: the TPP, labor policy, deregulation policy, corporate tax reduction. All are important. Whatever the government can do should be done quickly. For example, Japanese corporate tax is 35%. American tax rate is maybe slightly higher in some places. And I had I'll come back later. But in that kind of case, just reduction of 1% or 2% that Mr. Aso is saying is very, very lukewarm. So it should go to 25% in the second year or something. Otherwise, you cannot win the competition of lowering tax. It's like Japanese folklore. There is a folklore called hotaru koi. Hotaru is right one. This water is sweet. The next water is bitter. So why don't you come to this water pond and write us? That kind of situation. So there are competition between many countries to reduce the corporate tax, but the Japanese tax bureau is always considering the tax calculation, assuming the pool of tax is constant. So the Ministry of Finance doesn't understand economics or even arithmetics that tax revenues are the multiple of product of tax rate and the pool of tax revenue. And the pool of tax revenue is very flexible. If you strategically reduce the tax below the other countries. And of course, there are many technicalities. What happens if other countries follow again? Then the corporate tax fees will become zero eventually, or if there are double taxation relief, then this kind of effect should be modified. But basically, corporate tax, but bold corporate tax reduction is crucial, and not piecemeal reduction of corporate taxes.
Hello, Professor Hamada. Terry Jimbo with the Video News. Obviously, to bring about the real economic growth, you need structural reforms. And my question is this. I'd like to ask you the possible downside of the Abenomics. If the government fails to implement the structural reforms, what would happen if you obviously can't just keep printing more and more money without any structural reforms? So what kind of effect would it have if government continues this current pace of financial easing, and at the same time the structural reforms didn't come through? And what is the time allowed for the government to implement the structural reforms while Abenomics still have the power?
First of all, we have to keep continuing demand policy until we are sure that this ceiling is satisfied. If you stop, like Mr. Hayakawa insists, then the whole structure of Abenomics will be collapsing. Maybe it's a good omen for opposition parties, but not for the Japanese nationals. And if we don't do any structural reform, that negative side of this is this potential GDP doesn't go any more than the present situation. And it is not very optimistic picture. The potential growth rate of Japan is at most 1% or so. So comparing with China or the glorious time of Japanese economic growth, which Professor Okawa was studying, it is a pessimistic picture. So we need this structural reform to increase women's labor. That means about 10% of women's laborers are still idle from other countries' standpoint. From Korean standpoint, about the same thing. So 5% of population can come into the workplace in 5 years. That means this 1% supply constraints will be relaxed, nearly 1%. So it is, even though it is not the permanent solution, it is very helpful. So unless we do deregulation, that will create lots of efficiencies, I think. Take off hurdles to obstacles to efficiencies. So this is a better picture, but whether Mr. Abe has, we may provide more knowledge about that, but whether he has a political, I think guts he has, but whether he can have the environment to implement every bit of structural reform policy. But Mr. Suga and Abe are determined, so I hope at least a substantial part of it will be done. And the number of legislations, I don't have the number, but passed for structural reform during the last diet or so, statistically larger, much larger than other administrations. So there are hope, but I think many should share some pain. Consumers already share the burden of consumption tax to some extent, and the politicians should be fair to the number, shoulder number type of system, and bureaucrats, of course, should accept the reform and so forth. And firms, business associations are very glad when I say consumption tax reduction, but they don't want to give up some of the special tax measures that create some benefit. Or newspaper would like to have this reduced tax rate, Keigen-Zeiritz, and I don't know whether if newspaper is a little cheaper, that will help to the equality of income in Japanese population.
Well said. In Germany, we have reduced the tax rate for newspapers. It doesn't help much, at least not the newspapers. Okay, yeah, I open the floor now also for associate members. Yeah, please.
Professor Hamada, Makoto Honjo Associate. Professor Hamada, I'd like to sort of tag on to the earlier question of, and first of all, I'm a businessman, and so therefore, businessmen always tries to think of what-if scenarios and plan Bs. And what if Abenomics doesn't work or is sort of torpedoed by some reason? Are we going to be ending up with a lot of inflation because of the huge increase in the balance sheet of the Bank of Japan? That's my first sort of a tier question. The second tier is you mentioned that immigration is going to be very important. However, for instance, even your colleague, Professor Honda, is very anti-immigration. And how would you sort of like to translate that dichotomy within the sort of Abenomics camp or the advisors camp in bringing about change to Japan?
The latter question, Mr. Abe sits and quietly listen to sometimes conflicting opinions, and he will decide at the last moment. He doesn't comment on our ideas. I think like nuclear electric generation program, there are division of interests among people, whether we should liberalize more of migration or not, and so forth. We have good, very, I would say, as a Japanese, good ethnic culture and so forth. On the other hand, we need more workers to come in. And in Taiwan, I visited last week, they said they introduced more Vietnamese people. And because of Vietnamese tradition and Chinese tradition in Taiwan, it didn't have so much problem. But in the case of Japan, some ethnic problems occurs in Okinawa, for example. So it's not so simple. So I think this needs a long process of discussion and sort of experiments to make Japan compatible with increasing number of workers, but still keeping some of the present nature of human interactions in Japan. So, but that is a difficult process, I think. And inflation, we don't need to worry about inflation right now. There is always danger. The worst thing that would happen with money is that the money we have will reduce values every time, and that's inflation. So it is important, since government wants to use more resources. So there are, in many historical circumstances, inflation is an important danger. But in the right now, in the culture of Japan, the tradition of the Bank of Japan, or success of the Bank of Japan to keep price level law was so long and so embedded in people and in the mind of economists, scholarly or business economists. So I don't think immediate danger is not inflation. If Abenomics collapses, next will be the return to the Shirakawa age.
And okay, last question. I think now we already reached our time. Yeah. So I would like to end quite soon.
My name is Takeshi Ito. I'm an associate member. I have raised this question with a number of influential economists, but they all seem to deny its existence, no any knowledge of this, and this is about helicopter money. I think that the former UK FSA chairman, Lord Adair Turner, is a proponent of helicopter money, whereby the Bank of Japan or the central bank will just continue to underwrite government deficits. And in the case of Japan, he's saying that there's no way ever in the foreseeable future that the Japanese government will be able to reduce its deficits. They will only continue to grow. And I think based on what your lecture today too, the process is going to take a long time with 1% real growth. It will be a long, long time, and there's no hope that the government's goal to reach a primary balance by 2020 is ever feasible. So I'd like to ask this question because I have raised it a number of times, but everyone seems to deny or have any knowledge of this.
Probably I share with some other experts to not able to answer too directly. But if you think the national economy, there are two ways of thinking: the government, private sector, and the central bank. One way of thinking the national economy is that central banks and the government are, after all, the same kind of thing, outside the private economy. So we have to think of the combined government and the central bank versus private sector. And I think that is one of the trend of economics, macroeconomic theory. And for considering this, it gives some guide. If money is scarce, we would like to increase money. But there are many ways. You may distribute by helicopter money. Or in the present case, they exchanges government debt with money. Bank of Japan buys and sell. But if you consolidate the government, it doesn't make very much sense that money just goes out. So helicopter money and normal way of expanding money through market operations are not so much different. And if that is needed, we should do it. And if it's overly done, then we will have inflation. And other things I cannot get into. There are technical matters whether you should create money by buying goods or buying securities, government securities. And it has a different impact on asset market like JEB market and so forth. But drastic buying helicopter money or pyramid money, you build pyramid and government spends, and that is financed by central bank. that Keynes might have said, is another way. And it's interesting for theoreticians like me to consider the difference and similarity of these things. But the basic thing for our life is not money, but what we can eat, what we can enjoy. So the monetary policy should be conducted to use the full capacity we have. But at the same time, if you hold money, money shouldn't decrease value every instant. Or so that might have, it really happened in Germany a long time ago.
Okay. I would like to close the session today. Thank you very much, Professor Hamada. And as it is custom in our club, we also have prepared a one-year honorary guest membership.
Thank you very much.
And we hope that you come back before that to have coffee with us or a beer. And maybe, hopefully later, next year, to talk with us about economic policies again. Thank you very much.
Last year I got many reactions from talking here, and I really appreciate your attention. Thank you very much.